IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Rohan Seth and we are here for a weekly tech podcast. Generally, every week, Pratik, Sapni and I record podcasts talking about the latest developments in tech. More often than not, these developments are often limited to India or focused on events that are happening in the US and how they impact the world and also the context in India. It is very rare that we get the chance to actually talk about stuff that's happening on the other side of the pond, where also there is a huge tech ecosystem. I'm talking about China. Now, since you're talking about China, we thought it might be best to dispense with Pratik. Pratik, if you're listening, we are sorry. And get Manoj on. Because Manoj is Takshishila's in-house China expert. And every time there is a significant development, he is my first call. So Manoj, Sapni, welcome to All Things Policy.
Thanks so much, Rohan. And I'll tell Pratik that you told me that you're upgrading the podcast by inviting me and not him.
You're quoting me perfectly finely, Manoj. I am in line with that assessment. I agree. So, can I just give context to this podcast? Recently, we've had some really interesting developments when it comes to algorithm auditing in China. Now, we'll get into the finer sort of weeds of that. But before we do, actually, I wanted to get Manoj's understanding of how he thinks the tech landscape in China is. Because we talk a lot about antitrust in the US, but in China, there is generally a very different sort of an approach to how tech companies are treated. We've seen that with Jack Ma, we've seen that with Didi, and so on. Manoj, give us your broad understanding of how the government interacts with tech companies in China.
Yeah, and look, I think that there is. So, firstly, I would sort of dispense with this idea that there is a different sort of approach. I mean, it's different in a certain way, but it's the issues that the Chinese government is talking about and that the Chinese government has been trying to deal with when it comes to the growth of so-called big tech are not very different from what you're hearing about in the US, in Europe, in India. They're similar issues. It's just that there is a different policy ecosystem that exists in China, and there is different levels of state capacity. And also the relationship between the Chinese government and the Communist Party and the tech sort of giants is slightly different in the sense that there is much more proximity because it's a one-party state. There is an effort to try and build synergies, and government generally tends to set the direction of priorities, and tech companies tend to use that because they then know that these are areas where policy will be much more favorable, and then they expand. Now, that is not to say that the policymakers and policy has always been a step ahead of developments in the technology ecosystem. That's not true at all. The massive growth of, say, companies like Tencent, Alibaba, Meituan, the massive growth of different sectors of the economy, the gig economy, or whether it's from cabs to food or, say, e-commerce, another area. Those have all that development has happened not because of government prioritization, but because there has been greater space for experimentation. And tech companies have used that space, used the size of the market, and used the opportunity to then grow. Now, for many, many years, then it's been this conversation, and it's been lionized also, right? I mean, if you read Kai-Fu Lee's book on the AI superpowers book, he talks about this gladiatorial tech ecosystem existing in China where companies compete and there is ruthless competition. And that's how they grow. And you need scale. And once you achieve scale, you become somewhat much more difficult to govern. And so at some level, that's been celebrated, but also that's been a concern for the Chinese government. And it's increasingly become a concern in the last few years because there has been a change in terms of its thinking about the economic model that China is pursuing. This goes back to the 19th Party Congress in 2017, when Xi Jinping redefined this idea of the principal contradiction facing society away from higher growth to higher quality growth and better redistribution of growth, better benefits across the board. Now, when you think of that, you see tech companies which are increasingly becoming these mega players, which not only can influence policy, but also have sway over society and also become alternate power centers and can also, kill away entrepreneurs and new ideas and new companies because of, unfair competition and monopolistic practices. So that's the background of what we've seen in the last year, that there has been momentum towards this. Now, you can say that the pandemic in some ways exacerbated some of these concerns. As much as the Chinese government relied on the big tech to deal with the pandemic and continues to rely on technology firms, there was also this realization that, look, we are ending up in a position where these are really significant power sectors. And that's when sort of last year we started seeing a crackdown on monopolistic practices. And it was not just about, say, certain companies or Jack Ma or DD. It was also a case that there was across the board this action being done across different sectors where you've got, massive tech firms that have come up. Like I said, food delivery, cabs, to e-learning, to, sharing and other things. You had a whole set of companies in different sectors where the government was cracking down on monopolistic practices. The big takeaway from all of this is that the government wants to continue doing this because it sees some of these resources that these big companies have, whether it's control over consumers, whether it's control over data or control over big capital, as threatening not just to economic sustainability but also to political power. So therefore, we'll see this sort of continue.
I think that's a very well put description of the government's engagement with big tech companies. You mentioned Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers. I think it's a fascinating read because it also sort of, this ecosystem that's developed also gives a great understanding of how Western companies were a little out of context in China. So, for example, why Google left China is sort of a very interesting case study on how these two ecosystems are different. And basically, Manoj, we'll get to the rules themselves in a bit. But do you think that these algorithmic sort of auditing rules that have come out are part of a larger pattern that is evolving over time, or do you think it's consistent with sort of China's relationship with big tech? How do you see it in a broader context, so to say?
See, I think it's consistent with the changing relationship with big tech, right? There is, at one level, like I said, there is a power center that develops, and there is a realization that, and again, algorithms, now we'll be talking about the specific rules with regard to recommendation algorithms, but it's across the board, right? They're also talking about algorithms with regard to food delivery, or algorithms with regard to, how do you incentivize employees, service personnel, how do you incentivize drivers, what sort of rating systems you follow. All of that they're talking about. And that's from a point of view of labor rights. So there are multiple areas in which there is this conversation happening. And I think they're basically looking at, the current state of the economy. And they're saying, look, the structure of employment is changing. And these new sort of forms of employment, these new sort of forms of business are going to become much more prominent. So we need to have regulatory architectures to deal with the challenges that arrive with these. We can't let there be a free pass on everything in the name of innovation. There has to be some degree of regulation. What that regulation is what we're sort of seeing them experiment. So any of this area, particularly say with algorithms right now, to me, these are sort of breakthrough regulations, which the Chinese are stealing a march on, say, compared to the West. And these can potentially set standards, right? Governments in the West or say in India will be looking at this and saying, well, how exactly are they executing this? And can then something like that be, or if not exactly the same, can then some of those components be drawn from and being regulated and be implemented in their countries? So I think, therefore, it's really, really significant what's happening. And we will see much, much more of this. A lot of analysts talk about, what happened last year in terms of the regulatory churn and the slew of some 100-odd measures with regard to regulation being an aberration and a, political fight, a turn towards the left in the party. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think there is a systemic approach that's going to take place. And we can see that because the Anti-Monopoly Bureau of the SAMR has been upgraded. So you're going to see much more action in this domain. And I think the government sees it as critical to the economic model that they want to develop.
Right. Thanks for that. It's basically a prediction midway in the podcast, which is excellent. I did not see that coming, but I'm glad you said that. And before we move on to the algorithm and Sapni laying out the context for this, let's take a quick commercial break.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet talks to Prem Misri. Prem is the director and producer of the MX Player original web series Campus Diaries. On Shunya One, Shiliditya and I speak to Shashank Mehta. He's the founder and CEO at The Whole Truth Foods about various trades in the D2C food industry. Keep an eye on that series. We're going to be talking to a number of different entrepreneurs from the D2C space. On IVM Lives, our producers compare their experience studying across the various curriculums of ICSE, CBSE, and SSE boards. On Say No to Drama, Chetna tells us how not to be disappointed when things don't go your way, and the importance of surrendering. And on the Life Manifesto, Zarina introduces us to the Wu Wei philosophy from ancient Chinese Taoism. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And also remember, you can check out a lot of our stuff on YouTube. Go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube and you'll get a list of all the various channels that we do have. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. We're here discussing China and their new rules regarding algorithms in tech companies. So, Sapni, would you like to unmute and give us some context on what these rules are and what they say?
I think it's a really good point to jump from is what Manoj was explaining about how this is a part of the larger exercise in setting up a regulatory framework for tech companies, and particularly within that space, the idea that China can possibly set a standard and international norm in this space, that I think is most interesting for us as watchers of the space, as analysts. So within that context, this, I think, to the best of my knowledge, this is possibly the most path-breaking regulation that has come out in the world. Last year, the draft was out last year, sometime around August, and right now it's going to be in effect from 1st of March, 2022. So within this year or last year, however you want to term it, this is a critical piece of regulatory instrument as far as regulation of algorithms or data on the whole of the tech side is concerned. So basically the idea of the rules, the provisions is that you look at recommendation algorithms. And again, I'll refer back to the point that Manoj was talking about, how it's a range of things. So your recommendation algorithms are not limited to just your social media platforms or gig apps. Or it's an entire space ranging from e-commerce to gig apps, and in future can have great ramifications on AI as well. So within that space, in that larger picture, what the rules basically, it's called the Internet Information Service Algorithmic Recommendation Management Provisions. Quite a long name for that. So basically what they're trying to say is look at the problems that algorithms have presented us with, which is exactly not a novel set of problems, but again, the idea that amplification happens and there are structural deformations that happen because of the way algorithms function. So before you go and fully use it in the market, within the public, you will have to go through certain regulatory norms. And this is quite interesting to see because of how the whole idea behind tech for the longest time has been, go first and disrupt. So and algorithms have been at the forefront of it. And recommendation algorithms, that is what brought all of this to the front for us as watchers or as users in particular. We have seen the effects of this firsthand when it came to large-scale use of recommendation algorithms. So within this, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritties of all the 30-odd provisions, but most interesting ones, let me point out. So the first one, of course, is laying down the baseline that algorithmic supervision is necessary, and that here there is obviously the question of whether it can possibly be a dangerous sort of weapon in the hand of governments when it is deeply involved in narrative building and when it can be used as a potential tool for social control. Particularly, I'm saying this looking at it from the perspective of laying down that norm, which I mentioned earlier. So that is the basis for this particular set of provisions. And they move on to talk about how, the socialist standards of the country, the the kinds of what we often call the algorithmic black box, right? So they are not interested in, bending down to algorithmic black box and saying that this is not something that we can tackle. They're trying to tackle that head on. And furthermore, on moving a little further on that, they also talk about how even for a range of things, right? So that could be, the static and dynamic signals, which possibly is what makes recommendation algorithms useful. So that includes a lot of these keywords, these terms, and all of those are also concerns that the provisions look at. The provisions identify those as concerns, and even when it is a part of that continuous feedback loop. Even when it comes to optimization, user optimization, etc., discrimination is a point that comes up a lot of times. So that is something the provisions deal with exhaustively. That discrimination of multiple kinds and discriminatory use of, and it's an interesting point to note how that was essentially the cornerstone of the algorithm management provisions in their draft. But the language somehow, obviously, Manoj, correct me if I have understood the English translation of it. So maybe the Mandarin version of it might be different. So essentially, the language seemed to have skipped the word discrimination, which was really a cornerstone of the the prediction models and of empowering users. So discrimination was a particular plank that was used in the draft, which is now missing. So while discrimination and user control over what they see, whether it be you being a user of a social media platform or you being a gig worker on a platform which gives you gig work, it doesn't matter for as far as this particular set of rules are concerned. And it's also interesting to note how service providers have been given a lot of liability. So there is, again, going back to the earlier August draft and comparing it to the current draft, the penalties have increased, and how there is an obvious placing of penalty, which is something which is a conversation that has been missing for quite some time. While that probably in the sociological circles and in the political circles is something we've heard in the West as well, we sort of do miss that when it comes to regulation, because that's not something that's there as of now. So in addition to user rights, protection of user rights and making them empowered, it also looks at having adequate liability measures put in place so that the actual supervision and management provisions, which come later later on in the document, they actually make sense. In addition to having, the presence of legal liability actually makes some sort of a difference while these rules are in place. So that's broadly what's there within the document. And there are a bunch of interesting changes again, but I think we'll probably come back to it after listening to what Manoj has to say about this.
Manoj?
Yeah, and look, I think it's really interesting, and I think we have to partly look at it from the point of view of which are the sort of institutions, which are the bureaucracies which are involved in the regulation, and that's because there are on the whole sort of anti-monopoly work is very large, and there is lots of different bureaucracies at different levels that are working. So what you're seeing in this document is that there are 4 entities that have jointly issued this document, which is the Cyberspace Administration of China, the Ministry of Information Industry and Information Technology, Ministry of Public Security, and the State Administration for Market Regulation. So you're seeing these 4 entities, and therefore what you're going to see is mostly the issues in the areas that will come within the ambit of these entities be involved. And that is, I think, the first thing that we need to keep in mind. So when some things are removed and some things are changed, it's partly to do with that. There is separate conversation going on about labor rights and whether there has to be, say, some sort of unionization allowed when it comes to, gig economy workers, and how do you define how discrimination in that sort of sense with regard to recommendations and with regards to, work allocation and all of that, whether you calculate efficiency in terms of times and all of that, how all of that sort of comes into play. And I think that's a conversation that is going on within China currently, within the government currently. So that is the first sort of thing. And like Sapni said, right, there is a lot of interesting stuff in the document in terms of what are the kinds of things, and you can see the diverse sort of areas that they want to touch upon. Right, they're touching upon content and news, where they are saying that we need to deal with things like quote unquote fake news. They also talk about things like in essentially in using very Chinese language, but they talk about echo chambers and trying to deal with creation of echo chambers of online content or addiction with online content, and trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. So there is, I think, users, from what I understand, are given freedom to sort of even alter or change or the tags through which they are recommended, the recommendations to them happen. So it's giving them some more rights in terms of how they can. I don't know how many people will take that up and how many people will put in the effort, but it's empowering the user in that sense. At the same time, when it defines something like fake news, that means it's also constraining the entire ecosystem of information, and it's creating, because what the Chinese government may term as fake news. I mean, all we need to go back to is the start of the pandemic, when the Chinese doctor Li Wenliang had spoken about a SARS-like virus, and he was reprimanded and made to sign, something by the police which says that he would not be talking about this sort of fake stuff. So I think, that fake news thing is a little bit challenging, but at the same time, there is an echo chamber addressing effort that is going on. So that is again useful to see. There is also a lot in there about, say, different services being provided to people, how companies cannot necessarily prioritize the one kind of product or the other, price discrimination, or using recommendation algorithms to do something like offer different prices to different people based on their preferences. So again, those sorts of things, those have huge impacts on how businesses strategize and therefore sell. So this is massive intervention in basically freedom of business also. And who's to say that that's necessarily, that the businesses do that? Who's to say that that's a bad thing? It's you're intervening in the forces of demand and supply. But then that's how the Chinese government tends to do something. So it's useful to watch that space and what happens in terms of business competitiveness, and whether these regulations get implemented, how they get implemented, or how they get adapted based on, how whatever outcomes we end up seeing. Because that often happens. It's not like once things are said and done, that's how it happens. And I'll give you an example of this, right? Last year, the Chinese government sort of overnight declared that the entire sort of e-learning industry in some ways went from for-profit to non-profit, right? And there was this huge conversation, at least reportedly, that, there was a discussion about whether this should happen in a work reduction policy for students, whether that should happen for up to 9th grade or even further. And the Ministry of Education initially thought of like restricting it to 9th grade students and not beyond that. And Xi Jinping was not happy with that. So he'd apparently written a note on the file saying not sufficient or whatever. And so therefore they announced a far greater target of, all, I think, till 12th grade or something like that. But they've not implemented that higher end target. They've implemented only till what they had originally planned. So there's a lot of stuff that happens that we need to see how it gets implemented. Two other points that I wanted to make on the document was this thing about, specific protection for the elderly. And I think this is useful to keep in mind because China is an aging society, and you've got a lot of people who've gotten online, who've got smartphones, who are using all these products. And you can see that with, our parents who use smartphones to make payments, to manage banking or whatever. And you see that there's a learning curve to be able to use some of the things, particularly as technology changes faster and you struggle to adapt to it. And this, to me, is sort of keeping that in mind. There's a lot of, to the point where, technology, telecommunications fraud is something that the Chinese president speaks about. So it's a huge issue. And I think that's reflected in this draft and that's changed. The last thing, and on this, I want to get Sapni's thoughts also, and even Rohan, yours, in terms of, this idea that tech companies need to open up algorithms for reviews whenever there is some of these complaints or whenever there is an issue. I wanted to get your thoughts on that before I so to speak. So yeah, I'll toss it back to both of you.
Sapni?
Yeah, I think at least from the perspective that when it comes to the question of investigation, I do side with the idea that it should be open for investigation. But again, there are established norms of trade secret. Then when it comes to algorithms, depending on the jurisdiction, some of it is copyrighted. In some jurisdictions, it can be patented. So all of that becomes, it's tricky. And that I think is one of the most interesting bits of the new version, the final version, is about how there is a licensing mandate when it comes to news. So if you're an online news provider and you use recommendation algorithms to provide news, the fact that it needs licensing and then it means that the government and the regulator has to go through it and approve it. That is interesting, which even within the Chinese system, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think that's sort of creeping into the IP of an entity is something that's seen very often. But to me, it is something to watch for.
Great. I defer to Sapni on this because she knows more about this than I do. So I think what she said, basically. But Manoj, do you have any concluding thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the one thought that when it came to this business of, assessing algorithms, I mean, apart from, IP and all of that, which doesn't bother me as much, what I find fascinating is that, is there state capacity to do this assessment? Is there skill within the bureaucracy to understand what's happening and to actually make that assessment? So it's very easy to make a rule saying we will check it, but this is not like a factory where you're going and checking norms, or a restaurant where you're going and checking whether the quality control norms are being met. This is much more complicated stuff. So I think that is something, to me, it's interesting in terms of state capacity, not just in terms of numbers of people to do this, but also whether there is the skill and whether there is technological capability. And to that, I want to recommend, if people are interested in sort of Chinese regulators and their approach to technology governance. I mean, there are two people whose work I can recommend. One is Henry Gao and one is Dr. Angela Zhang from the Department of University of Hong Kong. She's done some really interesting work. So if people are interested, you can go and check their work.
Sapni?
Yeah, I think I just respond to that. And I think that comes down to the most interesting part of this, right? That whether upskilling will happen. There are two questions here: whether upskilling will happen when it comes to bureaucracy, and whether that is something other countries should look forward to and see how the regulator and the bureaucracy itself is skilled, whether that sort of an evaluation, that sort of a pattern of evaluation of bureaucracy will come in. I don't think I can predict anything on that, but that would be interesting. And the second thing, I think I'd refer back to what I'd initially spoken about, the algorithmic black box. So there are a lot of ways in which people are trying to figure out what's happening. While I am not a technical person when it comes to that, if there is an opportunity to sort of get more clarity, get more transparency there, I think we should be welcoming that. And that is why these set of provisions are probably the most interesting set of regulations that have come out in the technology regulation space in quite some time.
Sapni, when you talk about upskilling for bureaucracy, what comes to my mind is middle-aged Chinese men sitting at a beachside resort, smoking a cigar, and basically saying we've done wonderful things. So I think Xi Jinping is rewarding people by doing some of this stuff.
But I mean, regardless of whether Chinese men do it, middle-aged Chinese men do it, if it does happen, so, and maybe I'm being optimistic, but if it does happen so that we have like 20-year-olds and 25-year-olds who are extremely savvy joining bureaucracy across the globe, right? So if they are that skilled and talented to lift up the quality of the bureaucracy across the globe, because we have provisions like this and we'll have to look into that I think would be some interesting change.
Rohan, as a young man, I give you that as a career option.
Manoj, I think I'd rather go for the upskilling for Chinese bureaucracy as a middle-aged man. Humbly, I think that is just the kind of career I was made for. Thank you on that note for Manoj and Sapni for joining for this conversation, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST. or our website takshashila.org.in.
इन्फ्लेशन, फिस्कल डेफिसिट, जीडीपी, एमएसपी, एनपीए, इक्विटी मार्केट वगैरह वगैरह। दोस्तों, हमने सारे शब्द टीवी या अखबार में जरूर देखे होंगे या फिर सुने होंगे, पर हम में से कितने लोग हैं जो ये जानते हैं कि इन सब का सीधा प्रभाव पड़ता है हमारी सैलरी पर, हमारे इंक्रीमेंट पर और कमबख्त हमारे खर्चों पर। दोस्तों, मेरा नाम है अभिनव त्रिवेदी और मैं बात कर रहा हूँ इक्का दुक्का इकोनॉमी पॉडकास्ट से, जहाँ पे इस तरह के इकोनॉमिक और फाइनेंशियल टर्म्स को मैं जोड़ूंगा सीधा आपकी जेब से। हर मंगलवार एक नया एपिसोड सुने IVM पॉडकास्ट की वेबसाइट, ऐप या फिर किसी भी अन्य पॉडकास्ट प्लेटफॉर्म पर।
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Girala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders and change makers from across business, media, marketing and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app or wherever you get your podcasts from.